I'm 65 years old, and people tend to speak to you differently when you reach this age. They lower their voices. They assume you've settled. They assume you've accepted things the way they are. They assume that whatever life you're living now is the life you chose and that you're finished choosing. But what I've learned is this: getting older doesn't quiet your inner voice. It removes the noise that kept you from hearing it. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy this kind of videos, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. At 65, I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm not trying to convince anyone. And I'm certainly not interested in pretending anymore. This isn't a story about regret, and it's not a warning. It's simply the truth as I understand it now, spoken calmly, without urgency, without performance. Because when you've lived long enough, you realize something important. The most dangerous thing isn't change. It's staying in a life that looks acceptable on the outside, while something inside you quietly goes unanswered. There's a misunderstanding about getting older that doesn't get talked about enough. People think age makes you smaller, that it narrows your world, softens your edges, turns wanting into remembering. But what age actually does, if you're paying attention, is it removes the illusion that time is endless. And when that illusion disappears, clarity replaces it. At 65, I don't want more things. I want fewer lies. I no longer confuse comfort with peace, or familiarity with love, or endurance with strength. Those were lessons I learned late, but deeply. When you're young, you think time will forgive indecision. You believe there's always another chapter later, another conversation, another chance to speak honestly. But as the years stack up, you start to feel the cost of postponement. Not dramatically, not all at once. Quietly, you feel it in the conversations you avoid, in the dreams you downsize, in the parts of yourself you stop introducing to the world. No one warns you that the real danger isn't failure. It's slow accommodation. You adjust, then adjust again. And eventually, you forget what you were adjusting from. At this age, I've learned that clarity doesn't arrive as excitement. It arrives as relief. Relief from pretending. Relief from explaining. Relief from trying to be palatable. And once you experience that relief, it becomes very hard to go back to the way things were. That's why people misunderstand decisions made later in life. They see them as impulsive, reckless, too late. But from the inside, those decisions don't feel rushed. They feel overdue. There comes a moment, not loud, not dramatic, when the inner voice stops negotiating. It doesn't beg anymore. It doesn't compromise. It doesn't say maybe later. It simply states the truth. For me, that voice didn't arrive in a rush. It arrived after years of being ignored. Ignored during conversations where I nodded instead of speaking. Ignored when I said, "It's fine," while feeling anything but. Ignored when I convinced myself that wanting more was immature, selfish, or unrealistic. At 65, the voice didn't sound angry. It sounded tired. Tired of waiting. Tired of justifying. Tired of living at half present. And what surprised me most was this. The voice wasn't asking for a dramatic change. It wasn't demanding a perfect outcome. It wasn't promising happiness. It was asking for honesty. Honesty about what drained me. Honesty about what no longer fit. Honesty about what I had outgrown but kept carrying anyway. I realized something uncomfortable then. I wasn't afraid of change. I was afraid of being seen changing. Afraid of disappointing people who were comfortable with the version of me that asked for little. Afraid of judgment disguised as concern. Afraid of being labeled difficult for finally choosing clarity. So for a long time, I tried to negotiate with myself. Maybe I don't need much. Maybe this is enough. Maybe wanting more is just restlessness. But the truth has a way of repeating itself when ignored. It shows up as heaviness, as resentment you can't explain, as a quiet grief for a life that feels paused. And eventually, the negotiation ends. Not because you become brave, but because continuing to pretend becomes more painful than the fear of change. That's the moment people on the outside never see. They only notice the decision. They never see the years of inner conversations that led to it. By the time I chose differently, I wasn't chasing something new. I was finally stopping something old. People often assume that the most important lessons come from leaving, from the moment you walk away, from the courage it takes to choose differently, from the freedom that follows. But some of the deepest lessons of my life didn't come from leaving. They came from staying long after the excitement faded, from staying when things became quiet instead of cruel, from staying when there was no clear reason to go, but no real reason to remain either. Staying teaches you things leaving never will. It teaches you how easy it is to confuse familiarity with safety. How comfort can disguise itself as peace. How routine can slowly replace intimacy without anyone announcing it. I learned how quickly "this is fine" can become a habit. How small compromises stack quietly until you can't remember what you once wanted. How you can lose parts of yourself without losing the relationship, and somehow think that's maturity. Staying taught me how people adapt to almost anything. You adapt to being unheard. You adapt to not being asked. You adapt to shrinking your needs so the room feels calmer. At first, adaptation feels like strength. You tell yourself, this is what adults do. This is what commitment looks like. This is what stability costs. And because nothing is technically wrong, you feel foolish for feeling empty. There was no villain in my story, no explosion, no betrayal that justified dramatic action. And that made staying easier and harder at the same time. Easier because there was nothing obvious to point to. Harder because leaving without a clear reason feels like breaking an unspoken rule. Staying also taught me how silence works. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The silence after you share something meaningful and it doesn't land. The silence when you stop bringing things up because it's simpler. The silence that grows until it fills the space where connection used to be. Over time, you stop noticing the silence. It becomes the background noise of your life. And that's the danger, because what you get used to starts to feel normal. And what feels normal stops being questioned. I stayed because I was loyal, because I was practical, because I believed endurance was a virtue. And for a long time, it was. Staying allowed me to raise my children with consistency. It gave me structure. It gave me a role that felt necessary. But it also taught me this truth, one I wish I'd learned sooner. You can honor a chapter of your life without living in it forever. Staying showed me what happens when identity becomes obligation, when love becomes management, when togetherness becomes coexistence. Leaving gave me freedom, but staying gave me clarity. Clarity about what I never wanted to repeat. Clarity about what I had ignored. Clarity about how easily a life can be shaped by default instead of choice. And that clarity is something I carry with me now. Because even after you leave a situation, you still have to make sure you don't recreate it. Staying taught me how not to do that. When people hear the word freedom, they imagine something loud. Travel, reinvention, bold new beginnings, a dramatic transformation. That's not what freedom looked like for me. Freedom arrived quietly. It showed up in small moments that would have gone unnoticed before. The first morning I woke up alone in my own place, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt terrified. The silence was heavy. There was no one else's routine to orient myself around. No shared schedule. No familiar noise to anchor the day. For the first time in my life, there was no one else to adjust to. That sounds liberating. And eventually it was. But first, it was disorienting. Freedom, I learned, doesn't immediately feel good. It feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliar often feels unsafe before it feels peaceful. I questioned myself constantly in those early months. Did I make a mistake? Was this courage or stubbornness? Had I confused restlessness with truth? There were nights I lay awake replaying conversations, imagining alternate outcomes, wondering if staying would have been easier. It would have been easier. But it would not have been honest. Slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice, something changed. I stopped bracing myself. I stopped waiting for tension that never arrived. I stopped anticipating someone else's mood before my own. I noticed how much energy I'd been spending on emotional weather, on reading rooms, on maintaining balance. Without that constant vigilance, my body softened. I slept better. I breathed deeper. I laughed more easily. Sometimes at nothing at all. Freedom, it turns out, is not about doing more. It's about carrying less. I began making decisions without explaining them. What to eat? When to leave the house? How to spend an afternoon? Those choices sound insignificant. They aren't. When you've lived a life of accommodation, small choices feel revolutionary. I reconnected with parts of myself I had forgotten. The woman who loved quiet mornings, who enjoyed books more than noise, who needed space to think before she spoke. I wasn't becoming someone new. I was returning to someone familiar. Freedom also meant facing myself without distraction. There was no one to blame, no one to impress, no one to disappear behind. That kind of freedom is uncomfortable. It forces honesty. I had to confront my own patterns, my avoidance, my fear of conflict, my habit of settling. Leaving didn't erase those traits. It exposed them, and that too was part of freedom. I learned that peace isn't the absence of difficulty. It's the absence of self-betrayal. Some days were lonely. I won't pretend otherwise, but loneliness, I discovered, has different textures. There's the loneliness of being alone and the loneliness of being unseen. only one of those breaks you slowly. I would choose the first every time. Freedom meant accepting a quieter life, smaller, simpler, less impressive from the outside, but more aligned. At this age, alignment matters more than excitement. Truth matters more than momentum. Integrity matters more than appearance. Freedom looks like waking up without rehearsing, without shrinking, without apologizing for existing fully. It looks like living in a way that doesn't require explanation. And that, finally, feels like peace. The change didn't arrive the way I expected it to. There was no rush of courage, no sudden certainty, no dramatic feeling of relief. What came instead was space, a small but noticeable pause inside me. I began to realize that the discomfort I'd been living with wasn't constant anymore. It loosened at unexpected moments, on quiet mornings, while washing dishes, while sitting alone with a cup of tea. For the first time in years, my thoughts didn't immediately circle back to endurance. They wandered. I caught myself imagining small things. Not a new life, not a bold escape, just simple possibilities. What it might feel like to make a decision without rehearsing how it would be received. What it might feel like to spend a day without managing anyone else's expectations. What it might feel like to hear my own thoughts clearly again. That surprised me, because hope didn't feel loud or urgent. It felt gentle, almost cautious. I wasn't suddenly unhappy with everything around me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't desperate. I was curious. Curious about who I might be if I stopped assuming that the way things were was the way they had to remain. I noticed moments when I felt lighter, not because anything had changed externally, but because I allowed myself to consider that change was even possible. That idea had been locked away for a long time, and now it was cracking open quietly. I didn't label it then. I didn't tell anyone. I just let the thought sit beside me. What if there is still room for me? Not urgency, not rebellion, just a soft, persistent awareness that I hadn't missed my chance to feel alive. And once that awareness appeared, it didn't leave. There are a few things no one says out loud, especially when you've spent your life doing what was expected of you. One of them is this: endurance is not always a virtue. Sometimes it's just fear wearing a respectable coat. Another truth: silence is not always strength. Sometimes it's the habit you develop when your voice hasn't been met with room to land. People praise patience. They admire sacrifice. They call it loyalty. But they rarely ask what it costs the person doing all the holding. Here's something else no one prepares you for. Peace often looks boring from the outside. There's no applause for calm, no recognition for choosing quiet over chaos, no celebration for a life that finally feels steady inside. And yet, peace can feel like the first real luxury you've ever known. Growth doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with confidence or certainty. It shows up as small discomforts, as questions you can't dismiss anymore, as a gentle refusal to keep pretending that fine is enough. You don't wake up changed. You wake up aware that something inside you has shifted, aware that the life you've been maintaining no longer fits the person you're becoming. And maybe the hardest truth of all, you don't need a dramatic reason to want more. Quiet unhappiness counts. Unspoken loneliness counts. A life that looks complete but feels hollow still counts. These truths don't demand action right away. They simply wait, patient, persistent, until you're ready to stop explaining them away. There's something I want to do now. I want to stop talking about my life for a moment and speak directly to you, not because I think I know you, and not because I have answers, but because if you're still listening, something in this story has already touched you, and that matters. If you're younger than me, you might be telling yourself this doesn't fully apply yet. You might be thinking, I'll deal with these questions later. Later, when things slow down. Later, when the kids are older. Later, when it's less complicated. I understand that thinking. I used it for years. I didn't feel miserable. I wasn't falling apart. I was functional, responsible, reliable. From the outside, everything looked fine. But inside, there was a quiet sense of postponement, a feeling that something important was always being deferred, not ignored, just delayed. And delaying yourself can feel very reasonable, until one day you realize how much time has passed quietly. If you're around my age or older, you may be listening with a different ache, one that says, even if this is true, what would I do with it now? That ache is heavy. It carries grief for years already lived, for choices made with the best intentions, for versions of yourself that never quite got to speak. And sometimes it carries fear, not of change, but of disruption, of shaking a life that finally feels settled, even if it feels small. I want you to know something. That feeling doesn't mean you failed. It means you paid attention, just later than you wish you had. And attention is never useless. No matter your age, I think many of us share the same quiet experience. We move through our days doing what's expected. We meet our responsibilities. We adjust. We accommodate. We manage. And somewhere along the way, we learn how to carry questions silently. Questions like, is this really how my life is meant to feel? Why do I feel unseen even when I'm surrounded by people? Why does wanting more feel selfish? Most of us don't ask these questions out loud. We carry them privately. We tell ourselves they'll pass. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. What I've learned, slowly, imperfectly, is that living on autopilot doesn't feel painful right away. It feels safe, predictable, almost peaceful, until one day the quiet becomes too loud to ignore. And when that moment comes, it doesn't demand answers. It just asks for honesty. You don't owe clarity to anyone. You don't owe courage on a schedule. You don't owe your life a dramatic turning point. But you do owe yourself truth at whatever pace you can manage. If something in you feels recognized right now, if a sentence lingered longer than the others, if a memory surfaced without warning, that doesn't mean you need to act. It only means you're listening. And sometimes listening is the bravest place to begin. Before I end this, I want to leave you with a few questions. Not questions you need to answer out loud, and not questions you need to justify. Just questions to sit with. What is one truth about your life that you rarely say, even to yourself? Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the one that shows up when everything else is quiet. Here's another one. If time suddenly felt more limited than you expected, What would you stop postponing? Not what you would add. What you would no longer delay. And one more. If no one judged you, if no one was disappointed, confused, or hurt by your honesty, what choice would you make differently? You don't need to explain it. You don't need to defend it. Sometimes, even naming it, privately or in a single sentence, is enough to loosen something inside. If you feel comfortable, you can share one thought below. One word is fine. One sentence is enough. And if you don't feel ready, that's okay too. Listening counts. I don't have a neat ending for this. Life doesn't really work that way. Some days, I still wake up unsure. Some days, feel settled. Most days, fall somewhere in between. And that's okay. I've learned that clarity doesn't always arrive as certainty. Sometimes, it arrives as a quiet knowing that you're no longer lying to yourself. Nothing about this season of my life is dramatic, but it is honest. And that honesty has changed how I move through the world. If this reflection stayed with you longer than you expected, if something here felt familiar without you knowing why, you don't have to figure it out right now. Some thoughts need time. Some truths unfold slowly. You can come back to this whenever you need to. There's no rush. I'll be here, thinking, noticing, learning, just like you.